And I'm going to just do a short presentation. I don't think I'm going to be longer than an hour this afternoon. A short presentation. I'm not here to teach you what POPI is all about. You need to learn this thing. And I've realized that, it's definitely not one of these tick boxes that you can do. And at the same time, while I've learned, it's not difficult. It's not rocket science. It's just a matter of just being conscious of what the POPI Act stands for and what they're trying to achieve. And I support it because I'm tired of getting phone calls daily for people who got my cell phone from someone that I don't know and they want to sell me something. That's exactly what the government is trying to do. And I think we will certainly be on a journey. There are more questions. I've got more questions than answers about all sorts of school-related things. I'm going to try and answer them as we go along. And then what I will do from the office point of view is as the questions arise, we'll make a note of them and I'll keep communicating with you to say, okay, this question's come up. For example, I had a question the other day from a school asking, should I give the child's personal file to the high school, their primary school? Should I forward it on because the high school had requested it? According to POPI, you may not. So what are we going to do? I don't know. But you need the permission of the teacher, of the parent, to forward that information on. But I don't want to get ahead of myself. I'm going to go through a short presentation, which just gives you a big picture of what POPI is about. And the main principles. And then I'm going to go through that document I sent you and say, my suggestion is get you and your team to do the following over the next 2 months. And then we meet again and we update ourselves and see where we're at. And as I said, I'll get you some legal expertise to help us with some of those technical questions as we go. The first and important thing is this applies to everybody. There's no exclusions here. There's no exclusions. Every school will need to comply with this POPI Act. And again, I'm just trying to stress, it's not as difficult as it potentially seems. The big thing that I did mention, my encouragement to you is don't appoint one person that does POPI and then you tick all the boxes. My gut feeling is that the mistakes are going to be made by your ordinary staff members. So as I've experienced over these last couple of weeks, just a basic understanding of what POPI is all about is kind of what you're going to need to do for your whole school community, including your parents, your board members, and most certainly your teachers. So I'm encouraging you not just to do it and put a file together and then you've complied. It is very important that your community understand what is going on. Okay, so I just want to share the screen with you. All right. If you've got any questions specifically as I go, you're welcome to put them in the chat group, or you're welcome just to write them down. And then once I'm finished the presentation, I'm finished speaking. If you've got questions, you can just stay on, or you're welcome to leave once you get a sort of a grip of what is going on. Okay, 2013. POPI stands for Protection of Personal Information Act. Some people call it POPIA, which they include the act in the process. Okay, so what are schools obligated to do? Number one, this is kind of a summary. Secure the integrity and confidentiality of personal information. Number two, take appropriate, reasonable technical and organizational measures to prevent the loss of or damage to personal information. I'm going to be talking about all of these. Prevent unlawful access to and unauthorized processing. Sorry, just as I'm going, I'm admitting people, so it's just distracted me. So just hang in there. Prevent unlawful access to and unauthorized processing or destruction of personal information. In other words, you've got to keep it private. You can't give my information to anyone else. Identify internal and external risks to personal information. Establish and maintain appropriate safeguards against losing or damaging personal information. You shouldn't really be taking notes because all of this is in the stuff I've already sent you. Regularly verify and monitor the safeguards and ensure that the safeguards are continually updated. So that's in a nutshell what you and your information officer is going to be doing in the school. So that's the summary. It's safeguarding, it's putting structures and putting processes in place to protect personal information that is in your possession. Okay, so if we look at the sort of the journey that you should be on, if you haven't started already, or you must go on. And I've tried to simplify it. Number one is get buy-in. You should be starting at board level. Your board need to understand what's going on here, because actually, ultimately, your board are responsible. Even though as the school principal, as the CEO, you're responsible for the POPI Act, and will take the brunt of the can if there's a problem. But you need to get your board up to date with what you are trying to achieve. So an understanding of what it's about and an awareness. And as I said to you, and I've encouraged even in the documentation, it's so important that every single teacher, every single administrator is aware of this whole process and understand the implications of a breach of this act, and just how they play a role in it. Okay, so that's the first thing, is spend a bit of time explaining and understanding what POPI is all about. Secondly, immediately you must appoint an information officer. And as far as my understanding is concerned, the CEO stroke principal is automatically the person responsible, but he or she, you or him, or you can delegate that to an appropriate person. I'm not going to spend too much time on what the information officer does necessarily, or what the qualifications are, but the suggestion is, folk, get someone that is sharp, that is going to do the task. You don't want to appoint someone that is going to potentially let you down. Someone in authority would be a good idea. I would say at least one of your management team, if it's not you as the principal. That person needs to register. Now, we're already struggling with the registration process. Maybe someone can help me, but as far as I can see, there's no portal yet available on the information regulators website for us to register. But you would have seen that in the documents that I've already given you, you can make those appointments already. I'll talk a little bit about that process sooner than later. So that's your first step, is appoint someone who's going to take responsibility for your information in your school. So that's number two. Number three is you immediately go and look at what data you've got. Do an analysis of the data that you've got in your school, the personal information that comes into your school, that goes out of your school, that's sitting in files, that's sitting on computers. Where does that data come from? Who's collecting it? Who's responsible for it? So you do a full assessment, and you kind of map the journey of data. As people apply, they fill in data, and when they leave the school, what happens to those records, et cetera, et cetera. So that must be done collectively, primarily, I would guess, with your administration team, but I would include the staff in that as well. I'm going to get back to these just now. I'm just going through the broad things. Then you go into a risk assessment. You know what data you've got and why you collect it and what you're using the data for. Then you say, okay, where are the risks? Where are the potential breaches? It could be as simple as, the filing cabinet that you keep the files in, is the lock is broken. That's a serious risk. Or the office door doesn't work so well and you can't lock the door, whatever the case is. And you look at risks as a school, and then you need to look at the third-party risks, and I'll go through that with you just now, and then certainly the security risks. And once you've done a risk assessment, then you are able to put policy in place. This is your school policy implementation, a policy document. People call it different things, where there's a manual, and then there's the policy and procedures. This is how we're going to mitigate the risks. And remember, the law just says reasonable procedures and policies in place, that you do your best to protect the information. And when there are gaps and when there are breaches, we fix those problems going forward. So that's why I'm suggesting to folk, this is not that difficult, as long as we put some things in place. So you put your policy in place, and you obviously implement your policy. And then the last one would be you monitor. Just like any other policy you've got in your school, there must be regular monitoring. As incidents happen, potentially, you chop and you change and you adapt so you can fill those gaps, or annually you check, how's it going? You do another risk assessment every year to see where the gaps are, how can we improve with more money available, you can improve your systems. And then obviously we're going to be teaching and training our staff at the same time as we go. So that's in a nutshell where you should be going. And that would be an ideal journey to go on. So that's a logical process going forward. Okay. 2 important dates. According to the legislation, you have to register, your information officer with the information regulator by the 31st of March. As soon as I get more information about that, I'll definitely make sure everybody knows if the portal's open or what must we do in the meantime. In the meantime, what I've suggested in the paperwork I've given you is that your school board must appoint the person, especially if it's the head or the principal. There's a pro forma appointment letter with a list of the basic responsibilities. The school principal should sign that. Or if you're appointing someone else as your school information officer, then you appoint them. Then the head can appoint them via potentially via the governing body. If you're going to appoint a deputy, in other words, you may be sharing the responsibilities, there's a form there as well. And then the other important date is the July date. By the 1st of July, you should have your structure in place. In other words, all your policies in place, you've done whatever you can for now. And then the last step is the training and monitoring, which happens on a regular basis. So you've got, 3 months to get this organized and get your basic policies and things in place according to the law going forward. Okay. All right. If you look at the documentation I send you, if you look at the Act itself, there are lots of bits of information. It's so difficult to go through everything, but it basically speaks of lawful processing of personal information. You can look at the definitions I've provided for you. Processing means, what are we doing with it? Why are we collecting it? What's the reason for it? What are we using the information for? So have a look at those definitions of what a data subject is, what does processing mean, and all those definitions. I'm not going to go through them now. But according to the Act, there are 8 conditions that make the processing, the use of the information that you collect, lawful. The first one is accountability. So I'm going to go through these very briefly. I'm doing an overview because there's some principles that I've learned along the way and important steps potentially that I've learned along the way that I want to share with you. The information I gave you is quite comprehensive, and obviously the Act is there. So if we look at accountability, in other words, who's responsible for this information? Ultimately, the information officer is the key person that's responsible for the protection and the implementation and the compliance of this Act. However, we know that the school board have also need a journey or need information or the need to take accountability. So for principals, it would be good to raise this matter at a board level. And in fact, if I were you, I would insist that this becomes an item on the agenda for every board meeting. How are we doing as far as POPI is concerned? Because ultimately, if there's a breach and there's a problem, the board are going to be quite anxious about that. If the principal is not the information officer, obviously there's accountability with the principal as the CEO of your school. You're gonna carry the can to a large extent because the buck generally stops with you. You may have a deputy information officer, but I want to include that accountability goes down to every member, including the children, because children, for example, may have WhatsApp groups in their class, and then personal information in a WhatsApp is available for anyone to see. And they need to understand that, in fact, having a WhatsApp group is not a great idea. So I'll talk about that WhatsApp group in a minute. But I think the importance when it comes to accountability, according to the Act, they want to know who's in charge. So that's why you've got to follow the procedure of paperwork, of appointing an information officer and outlining their responsibilities, or a deputy information officer, because you can't just outline the responsibilities you like. That's quite set out. And that you'll see if you go to the website of the information regulator. It's all there, and I gave you a download of that in the information that I sent you. So accountability is key. And if I were you as a school principal, I would, in various levels of your organization, make sure there's accountability in place. And I'll talk a little bit about the staff in particular later. If you consider and you do your analysis, it's important to highlight who the people responsible in each department. So if I look at it based from my experience, someone like your admissions officer is dealing with personal information a lot. Your finance person is dealing with a lot of personal information. Maybe your marketer is dealing a lot with personal information. Your teachers are certainly dealing a lot with personal information. So I would have some kind of written accountability for every person who's dealing with personal information. And I'll talk a little bit about a teacher's clause a little bit later. So that's the first principle. You must put accountability structures in place. Secondly, they call it processing limitation. What does that mean? And it's an interesting one to try and understand, but it talks about legitimate collection. In other words, they're trying to say you may not collect information that is not necessary, that is not going to be used, that's unreasonable. And if you look at the documentation, I'm not going to go through it all now, but they define what personal information is. There's a list of age, gender, ID numbers, all that kind of stuff. And then they also then define special personal information. That's an interesting one for us because it talks about religion, it talks about race, it talks about belonging to these what do you call them? Oh gosh, I've got it down here. I've just lost the words. Belonging to a union. There we go. And even health information. We've got to be careful about those. That falls under special information. And I want to just pause there because I immediately thought of us in Christian schools. In my application forms at all my schools, I would ask quite clearly, are you a Christian? And how do you define your relationship with Jesus? And that's quite personal information. If you look at the legislation and even the documentation I've sent you, you will have permission. You may do that if it's going to be used specifically for a particular reason. So for me, it would be an element of their employment or their contract that they have to be a Christian attending church. So you may then ask that information. So even in your application forms for teachers, you may have to separate and specifically ask them to say, do you give me permission to ask the following questions? Or you may decline to answer the following questions because it falls under the special personal information category. I'm not going to go through all of those in detail. I think it'll be good for you to do that. And then there's a separate category for the collection of information of children. It does indicate that schools may collect information from children, but the big thing, you need consent from I think they call it a legitimate adult or responsible adult. In our case, it would be a parent or a legal guardian to collect that information. So these are the things that we're going to have to tie up, especially when it comes to your application forms for children to come to the school and the information that you seek from the parent about the child. You're going to have a clause in that document indicating permission to collect information and what the information is going to be used for. And I'll talk a bit about that now. And then, as I said, when it comes to staff and the information you collect about staff, and it relates to special personal information. So have you got a criminal offense? And even the issue around the sexual offenders register, that's something we're going to have to work out. I don't know if the government have thought about that. So we're going to try and find out about that because that's very personal. And what are we going to do with information? Why are you collecting that information going forward? And also, interestingly, as I said earlier, if a school, if you're a primary school and you're going to send the personal file onto the high school, what information are you sending? If I was a parent and there was maybe a disciplinary record that I didn't want you to send to the high school, I've got every right to say, no, you can't. So that we're going to have to feel our way going forward. How do we do this? How does it work in the context of education? And certainly I'm interested in that, and I will manage that. So the concept here is you must collect information that's legitimate. You can't just put information there that you're never going to use and you're going to abuse, as it were. But you must be able to defend why you are sending it. One of the biggest principles in this whole act is this issue of consent. The data subject refers to the child or to the parent or to the board member, whoever you're collecting data from. The big matter is consent. So a lot of what you're going to need to do is you're going to need to get consent in writing for using personal information. And some of you have done that already quite well. For example, your marketer, not that they're going to do it separately, but even in your application forms or in your paperwork, you need to get consent to use a photograph in your marketing stuff. You can't just use a photograph on Facebook and on your prospectus, on your website. You're going to have to go through the process of getting consent because that's personal information. So a big thing that we must keep in the back of our minds, have I got permission to collect this information, is a big part of the principles here when processing limitation. And then also, interestingly enough, the Act is encouraging us, or not forcing, but encouraging us to get the data directly from the data subject. If you get information from a third party, in other words, someone other than the person themselves, then you need additional consent for that. So in other words, you can't collect information about me from my previous school. That would be a breach of the information. And I even thought about it this morning. I passed on a cell phone number to someone without getting their permission. So that in theory would be a breach of the consent. So for example, you all work with third parties or call them service providers, and this is going to be a big issue for us, and I'll talk about it in a minute. SA SAMS is a third party or service provider. Those of you who use different admin packages is a service provider who's collecting information on your behalf. If they give that information without the consent of the individual to somebody else without permission, that becomes a problem. So you're going to have contracts with all those service providers. And I even thought about, even if there's personal information in an insurance company or workman's compensation, the Department of Labor, those kinds of people, they all carry personal information about our staff and sometimes about our parents and our kids. We're going to have separate contracts with them to give them permission or not to use that information further. So the big thing here is the issue of collection of data. And they're trying to say, as far as possible, you must collect the data from the individual themselves. You may not, or you've got to be very wary about collecting information via a third party because consent must happen. The third condition is purpose specification. Here, they're trying to say to us, you must have reasons or provide reasons, legitimate reasons for collection of data. In other words, if you're collecting a whole lot of bits of information, a name, address, ID number, race, gender, all those kind of things, you must just be able to define why you're collecting that information and for what purpose are you using it. And they're trying to just say that you may not collect data that's unnecessary, that you're not using going forward. Then it also talks about the retention of data, how long you are allowed to keep it. I gave you a table from the best research that I could do, and I think traditionally we keep some data, kids' files or teachers' files for 3 to 5 years. Then you've got to actually destroy it, and not destroy it by throwing it in the bin. You actually have to shred it or burn it. So even that process of legitimate collection of data, what are we doing with it? You can't collect anything unnecessarily. How we retain it, for how long do we retain it, and then the destruction of it. That's all part of the process, and it's got to be part of your process going forward. And according to the table that I set out, some financial data, generally we keep it a little bit longer, but even that, because it will have personal information, maybe about staff salaries and that information, we need to ensure, in fact, that we get to a point of destruction. And I know that in my previous experience, there's a storeroom full of files of many, many years of personal stuff. We need to get into a better process of doing that. The fourth condition is called further processing. In other words, when you collect data from a parent, for example, or from a child, and you want to use the information further, other than what you've initially stipulated, you've got to get consent for that. So this is going to cause a bit of a problem for us, because I know that even in a school, then this organization like ACSI or NAISA or somebody wants to collate the data for statistical purposes. Consent must be given by the data subject, in other words, the parent of the child, that you can process this data further. So you can't give this information, for example, to the local high schools, if you're a primary school and you give them a list of all your grade 7s so they can do some marketing or whatever the case may be. So the consent must happen. You can only use the data for what you said you would use it. That's the idea. You can't then take the information and process it further without consent. If you do, you must provide reasons. So in this context of the school, we may have to have a clause, as parents write the information, we may have to have a clause that says, this information will be used for statistical purposes by NAISA, the Department of Education, and ACSI, so that they know that the information is going to be processed a little bit further. So it revolves around this issue of consent about what you're doing with my information or the child's information. So further processing is something we need to consider. Number 5 is information quality. It talks about making sure that the information is accurate, it's complete, it's updated. It talks about if you gather information, you should, in theory, I think, according to the Act, verify who the data subject is. Who's the person standing in front of you? Is it the right person that's giving you this information, and is it correct? So, for example, you may ask for copies of ID numbers, certified copies of ID documents to verify that this parent is legitimate. And I don't think you need to necessarily do it that much with children, but I know that most of you ask for birth certificates, those kind of things. It verifies the ID number of the child. Processing, you must have a process in place that the parents are aware of, or your staff are aware of how they update the information. Now, I think most of us in the context of school, we would have a re-registration process every year, and we ask our parents to update the information so that the information you have on site is accurate. And if you're like me, I was super frustrated with parents who never updated us with the right cell phone or the right ID numbers and that kind of thing. But the Act indicates that you must have a process in place and try and ensure that it's up to date and it's complete and it's accurate. You also have to just have a process of how you archive, how long you archive, how long you retain the information. I've kind of mentioned that. And then when you destroy it and how you destroy it. And you've actually got to, in theory, keep a record of the destruction of that batch of financials or that batch of information going forward. So even if you send the information onto the high school, it would be a very good idea to keep a record somewhere of the permission that you've got to send the information to the high school and the fact that you've sent it to that particular high school. Okay. The next one is openness. The principle is openness. The data subject must be aware. In other words, it's just open communication. There shouldn't be any hidden agendas for collection of data of what you collect. So the data subject being the parent or the child or the staff member, what information do you hold? You can't hold information that a person is not aware of. What am I doing with that information? What's the purpose for you asking me whether I'm a Christian or not, or whether I've got a criminal record or not, or whether I'm on the sexual registration or not, or what is my gender identity or not? Let's not even go there. But these are the challenges we're going to have to face going forward. They must understand what the purpose is. They must understand that, are you going to share this with third parties? And again, you're going to have to tell your parents that the likes of the Department of Education will have access through SASAMs to personal information. Your admin pencil box or EduAdmin, whichever system you may use, other than SASAMs, parents need to know that these people hold information and that you've got a separate contract with them, that they may not share that information with anyone else. Yeah, and other service providers that you may have. So for your staff, you must let them know that your details are with workman's compensation. Your details may be on insurance. Your details may be on pastel, those kind of things, so that they know what information is where. That's the point of openness, that there's no hidden agenda and you're not keeping information that the data subject is unaware of. And then you must have a process where any person, any parent, any child can complain about a data breach. So I want to find the complaints department for all these cell calls that I'm getting for these people who want to sell. I want to know who gave you my cell number that you're trying to sell me some further insurance. That's going to hopefully clear those kind of things up into the future. Okay. Number 7 is data subject participation. And what this talks to us about is the rights of a data subject. In one of the documentations, I did list some of the rights that I took out of the process. So I've got a right as an individual to know what information you've got, for example. I've got a right to change the information, for example. So there's certain rights. So the data subject, me, the person, or the parent on behalf of the child, or the parent themselves, or the teacher, has a right to the protection of their own information, to change the information if it's not updated, and they need access to the information that you hold. A person can eventually come to the point and say, listen, I don't give consent that you use this information for this or that or this. I don't give you consent that you pass the school file onto the high school or to the next school. How we handle that, I'm not too sure, but a person is involved in the process. And that's the point of this whole thing. So if they want to change or withdraw consent, they need to be involved. And the last one, which is probably the biggest one, is the security safeguards of the written records that you have. So most schools have got a paper file for each child, and it sits in a cabinet somewhere. Is that secure? Is that office secure? Otherwise, it's digital on a computer. Are there passwords on the computer? Is the computer safe? Is the information encrypted? So if someone steals a computer, they're just impossible for them to get it. So those are the kind of safeguards, and I've given you a lot of information as far as that is concerned. I'm not going to go through that today, but this is where the sort of the rubber hits the tar, and the security safeguards, because this is where the problems are actually going to come. And that would come through your data analysis. What information do we carry? Who's responsible for it? Where's it stored? What's the security look like? What do I use the information for? How do I retain it? Where is it archived? And when do I destroy it? That's going to be kind of your analysis going forward. And then you do a risk assessment. We'll talk about that now, and a security risk assessment around that. So those are the 8 principles, and most of what you do go around those 8 principles. There's obviously quite a lot of information around the POPI Act that you can read up on. And I really, intentionally didn't want to do too much of a presentation this afternoon, because it is so valuable to spend some time reading, or your information officer actually doing the background reading. So if we look at a journey, which I want to just take you through the document I sent you, which I'm suggesting you do in this next while. Follow this. You're basically following this pattern. You get the buy-in. You make sure that your whole community understands what the implications of this act are. And if you want to read the repercussions of millions of rands of fines and all this kind of stuff, it's there. I don't know if that'll ever come to being, and even jail term. So on paper, the government are very serious about this thing. You appoint your information officer. That's priority number 1. In theory, you can't start the process without that appointment. So identify the person who's going to do this thing and get them going. This is going to take some time and some energy, or you get a team going that works with the information officer and you make it happen. We will obviously help you with this registration, and you register with the information regulator. You get onto their website, and in theory, we're going to register with them. If we can't do that, there's at least a letter of appointment from the board to appoint the principal, or from the principal to appoint a senior staff member who's ever going to do this. Then your next step is to do the data analysis. Consider what information we have. There are different categories of information in the paperwork. You look, what is personal information? What is special information? Children information, all those different categories, and you just identify, where does it sit? Is it on the server? How is it stored? All those things. So you do an assessment of your information and the mapping. Then you go on to a risk assessment, and I'll take you through that now. And then you build your policy document and your implementation and your procedures that you're going to follow to mitigate and safeguard the information that you have. And then you just have regular training sessions with your staff and your people, and you review the policy, especially if there's a complaint and there was a breach. You just fill that gap and you make that happen. Okay. And that's got to be, the whole process should be ready by the 1st of July. All right. I then gave you, in my last communication to you, a suggestion of a file. And I say this lightly, it's not just a file that you're going to have that looks pretty on your shelf. I think that may get you into trouble in the long term. My suggestion is that it kind of flows with the journey that you could be going on. I would encourage you to at least have these as minimum sections in your file. then you should be safe at the end of the day, or you would have done exceptionally well. I think it is important that your information officer at least reads the POPI Act, and then also look at the PIA Act. It's similar to the POPI Act, but it's also it speaks about the protection of information and access to information. So I would, if I were you, I would download both of those, put them in the file. I would also download the appointment of a information officer. That is point number 2. So I've given you some information there, and actually I'm going ahead of myself. That's what I suggest you do, and then there's space more for more things that you can fill in. Let me go to the process that I thought you should follow. So appoint the school information officer. So document 1 is a sample of a letter of appointment. You adapt it, and can I also just say that all these documents I've given you, I can't guarantee that they're perfectly 100% in order. We have got someone looking at them from a legal perspective, and if there are any changes, I will certainly let you know. But I've used many documents from legal firms and try to put them together to help us make sure that they are the best that they can be. Document 2 is the appointment for the guidelines for the appointment of the registration of information officers. And then secondly, document number 3 is the letter of appointment for your deputy information officer. I'm guessing that most of the schools are just going to have one person, and it's probably going to be the school principal. Just get your board then to sign that document off, and that document does indicate what your responsibilities are. The guidelines is that document from the information regulator. It would be good, once you've made the appointment of your school information officer, you must make sure that they've read that. That would certainly be a task. Read what the guidelines are as far as their responsibilities are concerned. Okay, so that's step number 1. Step number 2 is open the file. And I've given you a suggested table of contents that will help you comply. Number 3 is download the POPI Act as well as the PIA Act. And these ought to be read. Number 4, then I would start with a series of staff meetings. Now, you either do it all together. Even at ACSI, we've scheduled half a day to do some staff meetings because we need to comply as well and go through the whole process. But if I was a school leader, I would separate them. I would bring my management team together. I would then bring my admin team together. And then I would speak to my teachers. And at the next board meeting, I would train the board and keep them informed as far as the compliance is concerned. And what do we do there? Number 1, understanding is key. And what I would do there is in one of the documents, I think it's document 7, I've started listing the resources that I found, and every day we're getting more and more resources, video clips of people. I know that, for example, the D6, those of you who've got D6, the one video that I've got on that resource page is from the D6, and obviously they're talking school language, which is quite useful. I'm meeting with a company tomorrow, because they asked, or they advertised a school portal. So I'm just going to find out about them. So we'll try and keep that document as up to date as possible. But if I were you, I would have a staff meeting and I would show them an hour video so that they can orientate themselves by experts about what the POPI Act is all about. That is very important. And some of them are difficult, but they're quite technical and they relate more to business than to schools. But at least it's going to give everybody a fair idea and understanding of what the Act is all about. And then you can have a discussion as to how this may impact you. So I would definitely go that route. You must orientate the people. Number 2, then you start with the school data analysis assessment. Sorry, I just want to let somebody in. Which would be your data mapping. And I've given you what I would believe to be a example of a analysis assessment. You can change that as you wish. It's just a draft thing. But what you're trying to do is figure out what information have I got? Who's responsible for it? Where is it being stored? How long do I keep it for? How do I archive it? How do I eventually get rid of it going forward? So it's kind of a mapping of information. And that would be very useful to have all staff separately or together brainstorm that. And you brainstorm it so you can see potentially what you have in the school. Who collects information? Who do we give information to? You brainstorm the whole process, okay? So that you know where you're starting. This is your starting point. This is information we've got. Then you would go into a POPI risk assessment, where you and your staff, I would probably do it separately. We say, okay, where are the hotspots? Where are the areas that there's a problem? And you look at every, I even saw 1 or 2 documents, and then I made a security one where you look at every venue. You look at, does the door lock? Is there a security alarm on this thing? If it's not, then it could be a risk. Are the cabinets able to be locked? The passwords on the teachers' computers in their classrooms. What security? Is that a risk? Are the passwords changed regularly? Look at your server room. So you just do, based on the first bit of information, this information we've got, this is where it's stored, what are the risks? And you just brainstorm where potentially could there be a breach of information. And then the aim would be to mitigate those risks. So you've got to be clear, but you do need to have a risk assessment. I added this one, a third-party service provider risk assessment, where you sit down with your teachers and administrators and say, okay, who are the other people that carry our community's personal information? And as I said, SASAMS is a big problem for us. I don't know how we're going to solve this thing. And I wouldn't believe the government if they say they're looking after our information. So I can't say you mustn't do SASAMS now. Hopefully from an ISIS point of view, we will negotiate and say, listen, you want us to comply? You're going to have to give us evidence that you are complying with the POPI Act. But you've got many other service providers. As I said, some of you've got private administrators like Pencilbox or systems that you use to administrate over and above SASAMS. You're going to have to negotiate with them and identify them because they're holding information. Pastel is holding information if you're using that to pay your staff. As I said, you may be having insurance, Provident Fund things, all those kind of things where an outside company, third party or service provider has got your information. Do a risk assessment of that, list them, and you're going to have to start negotiating with them. I think the next document, no, it's one of the other documents going a bit further. So just at least know who's got information and what information they've got. Document number 11 is the school security assessment. I added that one in because I saw that one. I found it interesting, where you just look at every single venue. You look at your school buildings as a whole. Are there any risks there? The security of your server, the security of your files in which office, who's got access to that office, those kind of things. And you just do an assessment together with your staff team, and hopefully that will also help them realize the importance and the value of not leaving your desk with your computer on and the kids are there, and then there's information. Or like most of us, we've got the simplest passwords and the kids know the passwords and everyone knows the passwords. That's a risk. So you look at the security aspect of paper, in other words, the personal files that are on paper and the digital ones. And that's going to be quite tough. You need someone who's quite knows what they're doing to make sure the necessary firewalls in place, the passwords. When you do backups, how secure is that information, that no one has access to your digital information. But do the assessment. At least if anyone wants to know, we've tried our best to assess where we're at, what security measures we're in place, and that'll obviously lead you to a policy and procedures process that you try and mitigate those. Okay, in the next couple of months, we're going to buy new cabinets, we're going to do this, we're going to do that to try and protect information that we have. Okay, the next is number 5, is then your information officer gets to work. And this will be, to a large extent, his or her journey until you get to a point when you've got policy in place. Number 1, I separated a POPI manual from a POPI policy. Maybe you can have one document that includes information as well as policy work. But I just thought it was useful for me to put a manual together of useful bits of information. And I just took bits of information from a whole lot of different resources, as well as the Act itself, so that it helped me understood what POPI is all about and the questions I should be asking, what are the roles and responsibilities, et cetera, et cetera. And then I separated that with a policy document. So document 13 was a sample of a policy document and procedure. In other words, the school is going to do this. We'll do this every year. We're going to do this risk assessment. We're going to put those things in place. We're going to get staff to sign confidentiality and consent forms. We're going to put clauses in the following documents: my application form, my contract with the parents form. That's exactly what you're going to do. And obviously then you start ticking things off. And that'll help you if there's ever a problem with compliance. Whoever comes and checks the information regularly can check what steps have you put in place. So based on your risk assessments, the 3 that you do, and your security assessment and your data mapping or your data analysis, you put a policy in place for your school. And again, please don't just copy and paste mine because you've got to implement this thing. Take the stuff out that you think is irrelevant and you put in what applies to you. Some of you bigger schools are going to have a whole lot more security and risk things in place than someone with a smaller school. So make it your own. But I've tried to give you a reasonable example of what you could be doing. Then number 14, this is a really big thing that I think we've just got to go on a journey on, and I'm hopefully going to be able to help you into the future. You need to have service agreements with any person, organization, company that is holding information of yours, your children, the staff, etc. You need to have agreements with them. So we need to contact them. And as I said, to contact government organizations, Department of Labor, I don't know how much success we're going to get out of that. But certainly if you've got private people like, as I said, Pencilbox or EduAdmin, or you've got a private Provident Fund provider, you've got a private insurance company provider, you need to, together with them, have a service provider agreement. And you can clearly say to them what you want to tell them, that the information that they hold may not be used for anything else. A lot of the service providers agreements that I've seen, they're asking for consent. So they tell you what they're taking and they're asking consent to use that information for other purposes. And you've just got to read those contracts very carefully. So hopefully some of the service providers will come to us in the school with contracts that you look at and you sign. And that just gives you the security that if there's a breach from their side, it's a breach from their side. And you've got a contract in place of what they can do with information, what information they hold, and you give them permission to use that. So that's going to be an ongoing journey, and it's certainly on my radar to try and help you. However, I did give you a document number 14, which is a service provider agreement. Please have a look at that carefully and see that suits your model for what you want to do. And obviously, you're going to give that to those third-party people and try and get that work done. Then there's got to be quite a bit of work done that the information officer is going to do with school employees in particular. And that's now besides the parents' information and the children. You will have to get all employees to sign a consent and confidentiality clause. And I've put one together for you that you're welcome to use, document 15. That gives you consent to use the information, and you've got to indicate what information you're going to use and why you're using it and who you're giving the information to. So you've got to tell them, I'm giving you information to the Provident Fund, I'm giving it to Workmen's Compensation, I'm giving it to this place and that place. And if you change or you do additional places of sending information, you need to get consent for that. But then probably the key part is that you're going to get your teachers and your staff members to sign confidentiality clauses so that they do not breach the information that they have access to, because your teachers naturally have access to personal files of the kids in their class or the kids that they teach. They may not disclose any of that information. And at least if you have a breach there, you've got some kind of clause in place where you can hold them accountable for that kind of information. So the one thing, for example, that I want to raise, I think I'm going to raise it here, is this issue of WhatsApp groups, which many schools have. Most teachers have got a WhatsApp group for all their parents. Under POPI Act, that's going to be quite difficult unless you start the WhatsApp group again, or you get a piece of written confirmation from every parent to say that they give you permission to be on the WhatsApp group and that they accept responsibility, that they will protect the confidentiality of the telephone numbers on that group as well, because you may need to trace back any breach there. I know that there's been a bit of an issue around WhatsApp in the last months on social media about the safety and security of that, but that is definitely going to be a problem going forward. So you must get permission. Be very wary of your teachers putting together a WhatsApp group for the hockey team. They quickly put it together. It's a great means of communication, but you need permission to do that. Generally speaking, what I could understand from the Act, you only need permission once. You only need to get consent once to use that information. So you need to get the consent from the parents. So just in the back of your minds, beware of the WhatsApp ones, and you need permissions for that going forward. Okay, but that confidentiality clause is there. That would be part of what you need to be doing sooner rather than later. Number 7. So I'm just moving my bar. Communication, and that deals with awareness. You must keep informing the school stakeholders of this implementation, the measures, the consequences on a regular basis. It should be a regular thing on your staff meeting agendas, your board meeting agendas, and information to your parents. Your parents need to understand this. They cannot abuse the information that they have access to. And you've got to decide what information have they got access to and how they do that. And also, they must understand that they've got their rights as far as their child's information is concerned, or their own personal information is concerned. So you need to communicate to them what their rights are. And and for the board members as well, because schools will be holding board information, personal information as well. They must know what their rights are and why you're holding that information. So regular communication that's recorded in minutes of meetings is going to help you comply and at least show that you are putting an effort into this whole process going forward. Okay, then the information officer is going to put the following in place, which will be included in your policy document. This is what we do. This is our policy. This is our school policy. You've got to have systems in place where any person can request the personal information that you have a record for. So if I was a member of a Provident Fund with Sanlam, for example, I should be able to go to Sanlam and say, please provide for me, and I must be able to identify myself, what information you hold, for whatever reason. So a parent may be able to do that. How often this is going to be used in the school context, I'm not sure. But it's part of the process that the parents need to know that they can request personal information. They can't request personal information of any other child or any other parent, only for the subject data, which is them or their child if they're the legal guardian or the parent. Then if there's a complaint, you should have a document in place or a procedure in place that is well communicated, that if anyone is concerned about the use of their private information, personal information, that they can complain to the school. And then if you look at that procedure, if they don't come right with you, then they can complain to the information regulator, and they'll obviously come and investigate. And we want to try and avoid that. But just a procedure in place and how you handle that. Your information officer is the person who will handle that, and the process of how they're going to handle it, get back, apologize, and fix the problem, whatever the case may be. The information officer would keep a report of all the breaches somewhere in the file. There isn't a document there. I think you can draw up your own, quite a simple report. This was the complaint. This is how we handle it. We informed the person or the people whose information was leaked, and this is how we handle it. So you've got a record in case there's a problem going forward. And then the other big procedure, which together with the principal for sure, is to put these clauses on as many documents as you see fit. So certainly on your parents' contracts, on the information, those blank forms that you fill in. So even if you do it digitally, so even we're doing it with ACSI, when you update your information on our database, we need to have a clause there to give that you're giving permission for us to hold this data, and we need to indicate what are we using this data for? What are the reasons for the collection of this data? Now, I know even there, the big issue is this issue of race. And I was a school principal, and I just blankly refused. We're all South African, and I'm not going to tell you how many are black and how many are white and how many are colored and how many are Indian. And I don't know if this will be a problem into the future, but that is one of the bits of information that we do collect. And I know that the Department of Education like us to put those categories on SASAMs for the staff, and how many have you got? As long as there's legitimate reason for that request, and they provide that legitimate reason for that request, you can give consent or you can't. But This clause is going to be the biggest work that I think you're going to do initially, is as you develop forms, where any form or digital platform where you collect information, you have to make sure there's a clause there asking for consent, indicating well, they can see what information you're collecting, what you're going to use the information for. And then you're covering your bases to a large extent once the consent is there. If people refuse, then we're just going to have to handle those sort of individually for now. And that'll, we're going to have to then go the route of sorting out these consent issues going forward. So that I would do sooner rather than later. And I'm sorry that we didn't do this earlier, because potentially most of you have collected your information already for this new year, and that's without consent. You may need to redo those documents, or you may just send a separate consent letter to the parents and say, based on this is the information that we hold. Do you consent that we hold it? This is what we use the information for, and we commit to not using that information other than for statistical purposes for NAISA, for the Department of Education, for ACSI, and you can maybe list those people. So I think that would be quite a big work that you need to do. Sorry, I went too far. And then that's it, really. Then it's an ongoing training process. You need to keep a record of the training that you do. It's essential that the officer, on a regular basis, maybe once a quarter at the beginning of each term, certainly at the beginning of each year, a new staff member coming into your school, there must be a process in place that they understand. They sign the consent and the confidentiality clause so that you keep updated with the whole process. And then that you keep monitoring, like you have to do according to Umalusi. All policies that you got, you review the policy, you review your procedures on an annual basis going forward. Our commitment to you is we'll do the best that we can to ensure that you are compliant. I can't comply for you. I've got to comply myself. Just switch off. I just want to mute everybody. Okay, that's better. Thank you. So that's what we're going to try and do. As I said in the beginning, this is going to be a journey in the educational space. My appeal to you is, if you come up with some interesting scenarios, that you just send me an email. I'm responsible for POPI here in the office, so that I can try and find out. Because if it's a scenario that's related to school, like, for example, what do we do with the personal records for the high school that request them? Then I can find out about that going forward. And then secondly, probably, as I said, in a month's time, keep an eye out for it. I will certainly communicate to the school principals in my director's desk. I'll get some legal help, and we'll run a Zoom session with legal opinion. And then you can ask your questions. What about this? What about this? What about this? What about this going forward? And I will try. Our commitment is to try and make sure that we comply as well as we possibly can going forward, and then do as much training as we can. And as I said, as the scenarios come, we will handle them as they come. But your big job is to get this paperwork done. Once the paperwork's done, then it's a monitoring process. And if you do the paperwork well, the policies well, your manuals well, your assessment and your risk assessment well, then it's a case of monitoring it and just reminding people, remember, guys, you've got to look after personal information, and I think we're going to be fine. One or two schools have asked me, and I'm just about to go for questions. One or two schools have asked me, you know what, there are quite a lot of service providers out there that are charging a lot of money to help you comply. I've looked at quite a few of them, and I'm meeting one tomorrow, as I said, because they sold it as a school portal. So I'm very interested to see whether they understand schools, firstly, and whether it's going to be useful for you. If it is useful for you, I'll immediately update that training and monitoring a document that's on the website. And then even as I get good resources, I'll put them in the director's desk. So that's a request from me. If any of you as schools find good resources, or even some great people who really understand and may help with a webinar or a Zoom meeting, and are willing to do that without pay, then you can let us know so that we can get the resources going, so there's good resources for you to potentially use. But what I'm also trying to say is, I don't think you need an external person to help you run POPI in your school. If you follow this process that I've given you, I've gone through everything, all the major things that you need to do, you're going to be well compliant. And then we face the channels as we come. If you make a mistake and there's a breach, we apologize and we fix it. You need to be seen to put every reasonable measure in place. So I really don't think you need an external person who charges tens of thousands of rand or thousands of rand or annual fee to make sure that you comply. Because as I said, based on what I've currently seen up to now, they don't really understand the context of schools and education. But that choice is obviously yours. The bottom line for you is you need to comply. So how you choose to do that is entirely up to you. So that's my suggestion that you do. Spend the next 2 months, and then in the next month and a half, there'll be another session where some legal advice is there, and I'll be there, and we'll handle the questions as they come, because you would have worked with it up to then. You'll understand your school situation, and then you'll start seeing where the gaps are, and we'll try and help you fill those gaps, as I said, legally along the way. Okay, so that's my story. I wish you well in the journey as you go. I'm going to go through. There are quite a few questions here in the chat box. So I'm just going to stop sharing, and I'm going to go to the chat box and just answer the questions. If you're happy and you happy just to get on with it, then you're welcome to leave the platform as you like, or you just may want to be part of the questions and answers. I just need to find them. There we go. So you leave whenever you're ready. Oh my gosh. How does POPI Act affect COVID screenings? If a person is COVID positive, are they obligated to inform you? Maybe there's somebody here that can answer that. That is definitely personal information. However, I think that forms under health information, which is special information. If that information affects you and your organization, so it definitely will affect you, because you can't allow someone to come into your school. So you've got a right to know that. And all you've got to do is necessarily, potentially, indicate to the person what you're going to use the information for and why you need that information. And I think COVID would be covered under that. And I'm just talking from a non-legal point of view, because that information, the access to that information helps you and your school. You need that information to allow the person access to your school. May we have a copy of your presentation, please? Yes, I'll put it on the COVID website. I'll put it on tomorrow. So that was another question. Let me just see more questions. There's a comment. This is very interesting given what we need to enter into SASAMs. Look what they needed for application for relief funding. Yeah. Salaries, people's IDs, and contracts of school employers. SASAMs is going to be a big thing, and we'll handle that from NAISA's point of view, and we'll try and keep you involved as far as that is concerned. Up to now, I don't think you're going to have a choice, especially if you are subsidized. You're going to have to keep going with SASAMs, and we'll keep you updated as far as SASAMs is concerned. So this is another comment. This implies that a school, we cannot use pictures on website without consulting the guardians. Absolutely not. You must get permission to use pictures of children on your website or on your social media, or even of the parents themselves. So even these days, you often see when you watch TV, they black out. They make it all fuzzy of people's heads of people that are not involved in the TV program. That's all got to do with POPI Act. Unless you have a media consent in your application form. So that's what I would do if I were you. Part of the application form is, can we use your pictures? And some people may say no. That's going to be quite tough. You know, then do you include them in the hockey photograph or the class photograph? That you're going to have to negotiate that with the parents and make them understand that they may miss out on that photograph if they don't want their kid in any media at all. So that's going to be quite a challenge if some people say no. So I see that a whole lot of people have answered the questions anyway. So those clever people, thank you for your help. Philip, when did Sean send us the toolkit? You guys must read your emails on the director's desk, and you need to access the website for that. So if you haven't paid your fees, you can't access the website. We got you. No, it's access. It's there for everybody for now. If you don't pay your fees or you don't sign up again by the end of March, then you won't have access to the information. It's just better from a safety point of view to put it there. If you need any help with access to the website, please contact the office, get a hold of Honorary or Jeffrey, and we'll help you get that stuff. So if I were you, I would download all of those documents, print them out, and start working with them. We've downloaded them or put them in the Word format, and you can adapt them. You change and chop and change how you do a risk assessment or analysis. I've just tried to think with my principal's brain of what best to do. Okay. All right, I'm just checking if there are any more questions. How about staff and student email addresses? That's a good one. Thank you, Seppi. So I didn't discuss it now, but the Act talks quite a lot about marketing. So if you, for example, like us, we were doing a whole lot of sending out our newsletter. We sent out 4,000 newsletters at a time, and that was becoming problematic. And then on top of the bulk that we send, you've got everybody's email addresses. We can't do that anymore. So if you send bulk emails, you need to BCC them so that people don't have access to everybody else's email. So that's a good strategy that your administrator, your marketer, or your admin lady, or your admissions person needs to put in place. It's just a habit that we're all going to have to get into. So even if the teacher sends an email to all the parents in their class, they must send it to one person and they BCC the rest. So that's just a little thing that you could practically do. The question here was, how about staff and student email addresses? For example, Google in education. We're going to have to, again, this is going to be a big complicated thing because all our personal information is on Google anyway. How we protect that, I'm not sure. So I don't understand the IT world that well, but when in my reading, I did hear of IT specialists speaking about encrypting information. In other words, if someone steals a computer or they steal your server information or they hack your server, you've got it encrypted. Now, what that exactly means, I'm not that technical, but it makes sense to me that you code it. So anyone who steals your server information, they just can't read it. The information's there and your IT person knows that. I've got it on my list to do, is to get someone technical from an IT person to have a separate webinar or a separate Zoom meeting with you. And then you send your IT person here to get some help if you need it. That'll probably cost a bit of money, but I don't know what we're going to do with Google. And those of us who use maybe Google Classroom, we may need to have a particular contract with them as we go. I'm just checking to see if there are more questions. How do I manage debt collectors? You're going to have to get, I think maybe there's two parts to this question. You're going to have to get permission from your applicants to check and see if you can phone the previous school to see if there's a debt. Or some of you may do credit checks. As long as you do the application or you get permission, consent from the parent to do a credit check, and you explain, this is what the credit check is. I'm going to check your bank account. Please give me your bank account number, or whatever the case may be. It's all about consent. If you get a debt collector, my gut immediately, from what I understand, is you're going to have to get permission from the parent to give that debt collector the information. I wouldn't give the information as a principal because you don't have that permission. However, I even know that sometimes that information, for example, a garnishing order that comes from a court, I don't know. I'm going to have to find out about that information. But again, my default will be, there's a garnishing order that came from this person. Can I have your permission to give this information? So a lot of it's got to do with permission. So if you do, as I said, find out about people's debt from previous schools, just put it in your application form and say, this is what we're going to do, and we want consent. And that's the best time to do it. To do it now, once they're in the school, you may get some parents who are not so happy, but they always, when they want to join your school, then they'll sign anything, generally. So get them to do it then and say, okay, this is what we do ordinarily. We phone the previous school and we talk about the debt that you may have. If you've got their permission, then you should be able to do it. Okay. If we contact our local government district manager and ask them to sign a confidentiality clause, someone's sharing with me. Gerald T, don't share. I don't know why you're able to share. Gosh. Stop participant sharing. Okay. If we contact our local government district manager and ask them to sign a confidentiality contract because of SASAMs, and they deny wanting us to sign, where does this leave us? I don't know. I think that question, we will handle that from a NAISA point of view, because this is going to affect every school, whether it be public or independent schools. So this is going to be one of the big tasks we look at into the future. I doubt, if I was a district official, I wouldn't sign that. So if you're lucky, maybe they'll sign it for you, but I doubt that they will sign that for you. Another question, can we add or get consent for all new information collected? But I presume we'll also have to get consent for information we already hold. According to the Act, I think what I understood was information that you already hold, you don't have to get consent for that. You've already got it. Any new information, so any updated information, potentially. If I were you as a school, what I would do is let parents know what information you've got. They will actually know because they would have filled in the form, whether it be on paper or digitally. And maybe you can just say, we confirm that we hold the following information of yours, name, gender, address, and all that, ID numbers, etc., of you, and this is what we hold of your child. And we will only use this information for statistical purposes, to put onto your report, to submit to SASAMs. You've got to tell them that we're doing this, etc. And the same for your staff. What information do you hold? And then any new information you would need to get consent for and indicate why you are collecting that information. Okay. Hopefully that answers that question. I'm going to keep going. How does the POPI Act affect COVID screening? I think I've covered that reasonably well. If there's legitimate reason for that, you can say to the parent, I need this information legitimately because of the COVID protocols that are already in place. If you read the Act, that is a large part of the technical part of the Act that you may want to go and read. There are certain conditions on which a parent or a data subject does not have to give consent for. Go and read those conditions. So if it's in the well-being of the child, for example, for whatever reason, and you can justify that, you don't need specific permission. So maybe if you're a bit nervous about the consent issue, just go and have a look at those parts of the Act, and it'll tell you which items are not there. Please tell the department about BCC. Okay. Yeah. I will try it, Shan. I'll try and tell the department about BCC. I think it's going to be a journey for the whole nation to try and get this thing right. Thank you, Sean. It's a pleasure. Mark schedules handed to officials carry much of the learner's information. Absolutely. That's another thing we're going to have to check in our journey from NAISA's point of view, especially how we handle mark schedules, because that's personal information. You've got no right to know what I got from my UNISA exams. You can't, unless you can give me legitimate reasons. So even if you ask, we generally, I suppose, when we ask for new employees, we ask for their certificates of qualification. That's personal information. You need to guarantee protection of that information. So mark schedules, SASAMs is all going to be an issue going forward. Couple of things about SASAMs, which is an issue. Okay, I think I've gone through all the questions that I have. So I'm going to, if you want to ask any questions directly, you can unmute yourself and ask her further questions. Otherwise, I hope that's helpful for you. You've got some work to do, just like I've got work to do. I need to do this with ACSI. And any questions along the way, please send me an email. Any scenarios that are interesting that you think that I can research that will benefit everybody, please let me know. Any good resources that you find that you're showing to your staff, and that is a good resource and it helped them understand, please send it forward to me. I may not use everything, but I'm just going to share those as generously as I can to everybody. Good luck on your journey, everybody. We wish you well. And again, it's not a major issue. Don't overcomplicate this. Don't get too technical. Be practical and be reasonable in what you're putting in place. And if we mess up, we ask for forgiveness and we fix it. Okay. But if you follow that journey, I'm sure you will be fine. Okay. Unmute yourself if you've got any particular questions. Otherwise, goodbye. Love you all. Look forward to seeing you soon. And bring the questions as they come on. You're all looking at me funny. Hi, Glynis. Nice to see you. Okay, okay, now there's some thank yous. It's my pleasure. It's been very useful for me. I'm pleased I went on this journey. It took me many hours, but I've got a better understanding, and I'm pleased I didn't pass this on to anyone else. So it's my pleasure for the work. Hopefully it's useful to you.
Thanks, Sean. Appreciate it. Bye.
Pleasure. Goodbye. Anyone else? Any questions? Let me just check. I think there's some more messages here. Okay, just a couple of thank yous. Oh, I'm assuming that's 2021, not 2012, as on the slide. Definitely 2021. Yeah. Okay, sorry. Yeah, I think those are all the questions. I don't think I've got any further questions here. Hi, Renee. Nice to see you. One new message. Okay, pleasure, Llewellyn. Llewellyn, where are you from? Just unmute yourself. There we go.
From Kingdom Academy, Sean.
Kingdom Academy. Where's that?
Yes. Free State, welcome.
Oh, there we go. Ah, that's right. You're one of our newest schools.
Yes.
They're good.
Sponsored by
There we go. Kathy was there to visit you, so I look forward to coming to see you. And what is your role there, Llewellyn?
I'm the bursar.
Okay.
So there's another appointment today, so I was lucky winner.
Oh, no, it's all good.
Regarding the security and that works, if the campuses have security cameras on it, would we need to get consent from each parent that the kids can be on there?
Yes. So if you look at the Act itself, there's a section on CCTV cameras and the security of that, because that's personal information. So you've got to secure that. And then obviously you would need, I'm guessing, and I can't remember that section, you would need parents' information or permission to use that. So if you get a theft in the classroom or something, and you need to use that information. So number one, it's got to be secure. It mustn't have access to anybody to check it, only you or someone. And then if you want to use that information, you would need permission to say to those 6 parents, your child is on there, but we caught someone stealing something. Can we use that as evidence for a disciplinary hearing or something like that? So it'll be security of that, but then consent going forward.
Okay, thank you.
But there is a section on that, Llewellyn. You can just read up on that.
Great, thanks, Sean. I mean, so in terms of possibly if the teachers suspect that there might be abuse at home, obviously we would need consent from the parents. But if you suspect it's the parents that are abusing the children, then how would we go about that? Because then how do you get?
Gosh, we've just partnered with a company that has an app, and I'm just thinking aloud now, that allows the child to anonymously report abuse. I'm thinking immediately we would need to get permission. The parents would need to give permission. They know exactly what it is and what it's going to do, and that the child is going to report. And then once that has happened, yeah, I don't know, Llewellyn, that's going to be a technical thing as far as private information is concerned, you know. But again, if it's legitimate for the protection of the child, you definitely can then use the information as you wish. And if you have a look at the Act as to the times when you don't need consent, I can't remember them in the back of their mind. Go and have a look at that part. It's even in my documentation I send you guys, where you're protecting the best interest of the child or the safety of the child, you can use the information. You don't need consent, just use it. So again, it's going to be discernment. And if we mess up a little bit, we ask for forgiveness and we don't do it again, kind of thing. But the default is if it's protecting the child, you definitely will have access to it. So the big principle is safety and security, protection, and then consent. Those are the two main things. We do everything we can to get consent, and we do everything we can to protect and secure the information that we have.
Okay. Perfect. Thanks, Sean.
God bless you. I look forward to meeting you sometime. Have a cup of coffee.
Thanks. Looking forward to it. Will be good.
Good luck, eh?